Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased and honored to have the Speaker of the House, Kirk Cox, with us today. Welcome, Mr. Speaker.
Woody, it's always great to be with you, and really looking forward to discussing a lot of, I think, good things that are happening in the General Assembly.
Well, you've had a lot of changes here, and by the way, congratulations on the transparency initiatives that the House majority adopted. You've got, 19 new members. I think they've integrated well so far. How do you think they've done?
You know, a lot of people thought it was going to be a very contentious, tough session, and you're always going to have some. You have two parties of different philosophies. I think it's gone very well. We tried to do 2 or 3 things to make sure there's proportional representation, not just in committees, but subcommittees. Recorded votes in subcommittees. We are live streaming, obviously, the committee action. And eventually we'll do subcommittees when we move to the new building, probably. But I think very well. The budget's the big item next, coming out in about a week. One of the things we did several years ago working with Minority Leader David Toscano is that will have to be presented 48 hours before it's voted on to make sure the public also gets a chance to see it. So the transparency piece, I think, is pretty key. People are rightly demanding more of that in 2018, and they should.
And speaking more in terms of bipartisanship, I noticed that there is a Democrat who now chairs a major subcommittee on appropriations.
Luke Torian does general government on appropriations, and he has just been great to work with. I also appointed him to be not only on rules, but on the big joint rules committee. I saw him in the elevator yesterday. I said, "How's it going?" He goes, "It's like drinking from a fire hose." But he's a very bright guy, and he'll just manage himself very well. So that's a good step forward. And I know Chairman Jones in Appropriations really likes working with Luke. So
he's also a budget conferee, I believe.
He is a budget conferee, so I got to work with him for several years, and just think he's an immensely talented guy, and really looking forward to what he can do. So appropriations has always had a real, I think, bipartisan approach. I think the last few years you've seen the budget come out unanimously, and that's not easy because people have different views. They get to express those views within the committee, and then they come together and really put out a good budget. So, and Luke's a key part of that. He'll just continue to be a bigger player.
Well, congratulations on being elected Speaker. That's a great honor. I guess you can say that you have attained the same stature as your brother. Maybe you're the superintendent now of the House of Delegates.
You and I have talked about this. He's the powerful brother because he is a school superintendent, as you know, and he can call off school. So when it snows, that's the ultimate power in life. My 4 boys used to laugh. He would sort of let them know a few minutes ahead of time that he was going to call off school. So all the kids would call my kids to see if school was going to be canceled. They didn't care about the General Assembly. So, but he's a great guy. I love, he's 3 years older and just been a great supporter of mine.
Well, let's talk about the budget since you mentioned it, especially in terms of what happened as a result of the Tax Reform Act in Washington. I understand that there were a lot of unanticipated revenues that flowed into the state right at the end of last year.
Yeah, no question, and we're trying to figure that out because we're trying to sort of figure out, you know, how many of the people we call non-withholding that pay estimated taxes, how many of them were given sort of tax advice to pay early. Obviously, our revenue collections are very good right now. They're probably in the 5.7, 5.8% range. We were predicting about 3.1, and so if it continues like it is now, which I do not think it will, we'll run about a $400 million surplus. But I think some of the money we're getting in right now is probably people doing tax planning, et cetera. I still think we'll do well. I think we'll hit all of our budget, check marks. And you'll see, and I love this about Virginia, you don't see it in Washington. Republicans and Democrats know we have to balance the budget. We work together, we will. And so I think it'll be a very good budget. It's got some second-year teacher pay raises, state employees, our sheriff's deputies, I think we particularly need to look after.
Some correction officers, I believe.
Thank you for mentioning that. That is a huge problem right now with the way correction officers are paid. So we'll see. Budget hasn't come out yet, but certainly like to make some progress in that area.
Now, what about Medicaid? I
Sure.
understand that the Chairman of Commerce and Labor just indicated he's is in support of what's called the Kentucky plan now.
Yeah, I've had some good discussions with Governor Northam, and really appreciate that relationship. We've had two private discussions on Medicaid, and I mean, let me tell you where Kirk Cox is coming from. I told him I sort of handed him what I consider 6 principles or Republican principles that we thought was pretty essential if we're going to look at Medicaid and obviously any kind of expansion. And some of those were things like a work requirement, but it's more than just a work requirement. It's got really some key education training, et cetera, putting in some of that workforce money we should be using for any way to give people credentialing, et cetera. I think everyone wants folks to basically have good jobs where they can eventually come off the Medicaid roll. So that's certainly a goal. One of the points of contention has been the Medicaid expansion is a 90% federal, 10% state match. Traditional Medicaid is a 50-50 match. So obviously it's much more generous from the federal government. Our concern has been with federal deficits, can they hold that 90-10 match? So one of the things we would like to see is they drop below that. If they do not meet their commitment, then basically there's a kill switch and we don't do expansion. And I think the other thing is that I really want to see is not just Kentucky, Indiana, some other states have done some very innovative things with healthcare savings accounts, having people pay modest premiums just so they'll have some ownership, and giving them credits for things like wellness checkups. If they go to the emergency room for non-emergency matters, having a copay, trying to incentivize people to go to their regular doc. So once again, my stance on Medicaid is going to be, will the governor and the administration go along with a lot of those key principles? And some of it's timing too. Obviously, Governor Northam would like to expand Medicaid right away. I would like to get the waivers and a lot of those things in place.
Now, those can take a year and a half, can they?
I think it's going to be much faster than that. That's what everyone's saying. But the Trump administration has indicated that they really like the waivers. They approved the Kentucky waivers. And so I don't think it's going to take that long. And that's a great point because I know the administration fears that. I do not think it will take that long. I think, as a matter of fact, that you can now apply and you'll get a much quicker response. Kentucky, of course, got their work requirement through, and I would say you could do it in 6 months. And I think that's something, frankly, the Trump administration is going to want to see. If you do expansion, that you're also doing key reforms. So I would argue it's not going to take a year, which might solve some of our problems.
So what percentage of the budget does Medicaid take up now?
Well, everyone argues back and forth, but probably 22%. When I came in, it was probably in the single digits. Now, let me say this. Some of that is good. Medicaid, serves the disabled population. Some of our folks have intellectual disabilities, et cetera, who are just incredible folks. You have families that are, wonderful families that want to keep their loved ones at home. That's Medicaid also. The expansion population obviously is 100 to 138% of poverty level. And so that will be more of an able-bodied population. So if you can do it with the key reforms, then I think, hey, that's doable. If not, then I've been very candid, then I'm very skeptical. But let's hope. We made some good progress in early talks, and let's see where we can go.
Is anybody looking at the population, the dual eligibles, Medicare, Medicaid folks who unfortunately are suffering or who will suffer from dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Those costs can cause real problems in the future.
Actually, it's a great question. People have made this point. We have done a ton of reforms already. And dual eligible was one of those, where basically we have been running some dual eligible pilot projects that, they've been tough to sort of work out, but I think they've been somewhat successful. And so I think as part of the conversation, we would try to maybe continue to try to deal with that population. But we've got some good models, I think, now that both sides agree to on dual eligible. So hopefully we can make some further progress with those. But they're the toughest cases, no question.
There's some legislation that's coming over from the Senate that Senator Donovan sponsored, dealing with a very narrow population, which would include some assessment against hospitals.
Yes, if I understand it, the way her legislation works is it's still just traditional Medicaid as far as the match goes. So it's still a 50-50 match, so you got to come up with the money. She is trying to cover, obviously, some more of, I just talked about some of the people that are looking for waiver slots. She is looking at covering, I think, more people in the substance abuse area, the mental health area. We've been trying to make some progress on that the last few years anyway, because that's a huge issue. So I think it's all, and once again, since I'm not in the Senate, but I think it's 20,000 people around that she would try to cover. The problem is, though, that they seem to be divided on what's called the provider assessment, where you basically have hospitals help pay that. And by the way, the theory behind that is they're having to do a lot of the indigent care anyway. So obviously, if you're taking some of that away, there's a cost savings. But I think there's a little bit of dispute in the Senate. Are they going to include that or not? If they don't include that, then you have to figure out a way. How do you even pay for that reduced population? So that will be the challenge.
To what extent does the opioid crisis exacerbate the whole healthcare issue?
That's a good question. I mean, it's huge everywhere. Southwest Virginia probably even more than, and it does. I think that's something that we've had a series of bills in, but obviously we're going to have to really step up what we do in that area. So, and there are all kinds of issues you're dealing with, overprescribing to some degree, some people that go in for surgery and then end up hooked on an opioid. And then you have, the piece of, is there enough counseling services? Are you making sure that, people are really, mentored through that process? Are physicians aware and they're training, how that can be abused? There's some really good pilot projects, but the whole Medicaid debate is somewhat on that too. I mean, coverage of that. So yeah, there's no question. I think for everyone that's a huge issue.
Still have a lingering issue about closing the training centers. I've noticed a number of bills, especially in around Central Virginia, that training center, trying to stop that process.
Yeah, what a tough issue. I mean, locally, of course, our training center, was closed several years ago. The quick history, which I think a lot of people know, but the Department of Justice basically came in and said that you need to have as a model transitioning folks into the community, because that's what is considered, I guess, in modern day, the more humane, and integration of the community is very important. So basically ordered a lot of the training centers closed. They were on a schedule, so you had, obviously, them closed in Northern Virginia, et cetera. And so the theory is that some people feel like all that's left now in some of the training centers, whether it be Central or et cetera, are the most needy folks that have multiple health issues, et cetera. And should there be a smaller footprint facility for them, much less beds, or should you just finish up the process by which they'd be totally integrated into society? Down in the eastern part of the state, we did a smaller footprint facility. And so I guess the argument is, should you try that also maybe in the western or central part of the state? But right now, if nothing happens, they are, as you know, scheduled to close on a pretty aggressive schedule. So I think rightly some of the delegates from those regions go, are there community supports for those folks in those communities? Can they stay in the community where they have to go to places like Eastern State, or where they have to go to different part? Can families be close to them? Is that practical? There just seem to be an interim or a little bit of a different solution. So we'll see. The budget might try to address that. It's expensive no matter which way you do. You got to consider what DOJ is going to do, whatever you do.
And we're talking about individuals who have been institutionalized, many of them for years, and they're adults now.
Yes. And you got, and obviously a lot of the folks who were rightly transitioned out of some of the trainer centers were, I hate to say the easier cases, but that's exactly what they were. So you're right. Now you're left to some people that have been there for years. they're comfortable in those facilities, and they do provide a lot of acute care. Some people on the other side of the argument would argue that, you know, those community services have been dramatically stepped up, and you need to really try to do total integration. But I'm probably more of, when you can transition, that's a really good thing. But I do think there's probably a core population you're really going to have to be thoughtful on in the future, whether that's the solution or not with those multiple health issues.
Would you say that the big issue in transportation this year is the continued funding of the Washington Metropolitan?
Yeah, no question. Metro is a huge issue for Northern Virginia, and it's a twofold issue. There's a money component of both Metro looking for both the federal government and the individual states and DC to step up, and the reform component. And it's a lot like Medicaid, to be honest with you, in that Metro probably does need the money. To some degree, it's the lifeblood of Northern Virginia. But we've been a bit frustrated that even though I think currently they've done a better job with some of their safety record, but they went years without really looking at safety. And so obviously that's been a problem. The ridership has not been what it should have been. They have tremendously high labor costs. When you look at systems like Boston and New York, they're higher than both of them. They have a real issue with overtime pay and pensions and getting those costs under control. So the House basically put together a package of about $100 million for Metro. Senate's richer, about $150 million. Ours is mainly, you know, existing resources. Theirs have a few tax increases. But I think both are saying we need some of the money. Both have in there got to be some reforms. For example, in our budget, we say if you go over 2% in operating costs, if you just keep inflating, you're going to lose a percentage of that money. And so if we can work out the reform component, I think you'll see, hopefully, a solution come out for Metro. It's just both sides have got to be willing to compromise in that. Let's see true reforms, and just don't tell us you're going to reform. And then there's a need for some money to make sure the system works.
Still had a lot of angst in Northern Virginia about the high tolls on I-66. That's going to continue. We still have smart scale. I take it you believe that that's still working well?
Yeah, I mean, I think smart scale does work well. I mean, the old way that was done, obviously the projects weren't always judged on their merit. The theory behind smart scale was that you're scored, and each region can sort of help set their score up. I mean, obviously, Southwest Virginia is going to have a higher score than if you bring economic development. Northern Virginia is going to have a higher score for congestion. So yeah, I think the principle is very good. It got some of the politics out of funding roads. There were a few small down consequences. Chesterfield, for example, had a great revenue sharing. We were giving right much money for this revenue sharing program. So if the county would kick in, the state would kick in. And Chesterfield was very aggressive with that. Because they were trying to make sure there was a big enough money for smart scale, that revenue sharing piece went down some. So that hurt a place like Chesterfield that was using that program very effectively. Some other people weren't. But I would say overall, smart scale is working very, very well.
Some innovative legislation from members from Southwest and South Side dealing with an attempt to revitalize that area by attracting businesses. Will Moorfield has a bill. He's very passionate about it. It's passed the House. I believe it's going to be considered in the Senate. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's an interesting bill. Will Moorfield from Buchanan County is teamed up with LaShreese Aird, who I know very well from Petersburg. And it's basically localities that have really struggled with, you know, unemployment and, you know, all just jobs in particular. And it's an interesting piece of legislation that actually sort of is geared to those areas and trying to incentivize not retail, but, you know, companies that would, you know, be much more, you know, I guess in sort of an advanced manufacturing or that type of space. They don't already have companies that naturally would not come to those areas. And it has a series of tax breaks both on the corporate side and individual income tax for the people that work at those companies. I think it's like a 10-year, you know, window. And so I think it's innovative. I mean, I voted for it. It has some challenges they'll have to overcome. I think they're trying to address those. There's some concerns among some people. How will existing businesses react to that because their employees don't get that break? And so those are some of the issues. But I think Will would say that we've got to be innovative. We've got, you know, people that have not had jobs for years, and we just really need something to get, you know, companies to really look at us. So, I admire him. I think we need to look at it, and probably need to be some tweaks take place between now and then, but most legislation needs that, so we'll see.
Yet I know Senator Chafin has pursued some legislation which would allow for these hydroelectric power plants to be constructed there, which would, bring jobs and future employment for people as well.
Yeah, they're trying all kinds of things. They're really trying the Southwest, which is interesting, tourism, not something you would readily talk a lot about, but they have some real niche tourism type of initiatives. They have University of Virginia at Wise, I think has tremendous potential to not only do telemedicine, but do some other really interesting things, as far as working with industry that comes into there. So they're going to, and coal, I think will rebound somewhat, especially maybe in the export markets, but obviously they know they have to diversify their economy, and it's tough. I mean, how do you do that? How do you sustain the workplace? How do we get credentialing out there that they need? They have such an out-migration, so I think those types of innovative pieces. And it's interesting, the Dominion bill, which has been so argued both ways, has an interesting broadband piece in it. Because obviously with Dominion, its size, et cetera, and obviously that bill would help out with extending broadband to some of the more rural areas. So there's some interesting side pieces you don't even think about that maybe will help Southwest Virginia.
Let's talk about Dominion, because there's been controversy about the legislation that recently passed the House. There's a different version in the Senate. The one in the House passed with an amendment to avoid what's known as double dipping. That bill is an attempt to correct what occurred in 2015, I believe. You can give us a little bit of
it's a complex issue. Under President Obama's administration, I think the fear was that, with the some of the clean energy initiatives, that particularly, it helped some states, it hurt some states. With our coal industry, and we had built a lot of new coal-fired plants, that particular legislation tend not to favor coal, even new plants. And so the theory behind that was that a lot of those plants were going to have to almost immediately go offline, and there would be a real problem with rates. So that's when the rates were frozen, and it's anticipation what was going to happen with that clean power plant bill. Obviously, when the Trump administration came in, they had a different philosophy, so the need for that sort of went away. So we went, there's no use freezing rates, we're in a different climate, so what can we do? And so the thought was, can you come up with sort of an innovative model? And so the model basically does a lot of different things. First of all, it will basically unfreeze the rates. The SEC will have oversight, and I think the oversight piece is every 3 years. The taxpayers will get back, and this is how the bill's been improved. I think when the bill started out, they would get back about $135 million. That's up to about $200 million. Obviously, Dominion made off very well on the Trump tax cuts. They're probably $100 million worth of tax benefits Dominion gets. Part of the piece of this bill is that will be refunded back to the consumers earlier than they would have been forced to do it under any kind of SEC regulation. There's a big piece on renewables, and this is the big debate, and security of the grid. And so it allows Dominion to take some of their over-earnings and obviously do that towards grid security, towards solar, various other things. So that's a big piece. There's an undergrounding piece in Northern Virginia that some people are particularly keen on in Northern Virginia, so that's very expensive to underground. There's the broadband piece. So in all, about $1 billion. Others would argue, and I voted for it, others would argue that it should just basically be turned over to the SEC, back to the way it was, straight oversight, et cetera. The double dipping issue is very complex. Depends on who you talk to. Some people say, there might be a slight double dip component, maybe 10%. Other people say it's much larger than that. Other people say there's not a double dipping component. So there was an amendment on the floor to basically assure there wasn't double dipping. But I'm not sure that amendment, frankly, doesn't have some unintended consequences. So long answer. The goal of everyone is not to have double dipping. So what I hope will take place in the Commerce and Labor Committee is they'll take that amendment, refine it where it really gets to what they're trying to do, and not, it sort of disincentivizes, I think the way the amendment works now, probably investment in infrastructure, et cetera, the way it's written. So I think we're going to have to work on that, but let's hope we can solve that problem, because that's a problem we don't want to have happen. So no one's for that. Can we solve it through language?
Another bipartisan matter that you've worked on with the governor and your colleagues deals with regulatory reform.
That's huge for us. I mean, one of the things as Republicans we feel very strongly about is, and regulations needed for health and safety, no one's arguing that, but we really gotten carried away. I mean, I have more people that want to get into various professions, et cetera, and go, gosh, it takes me a year to get a license or 2 years. Other states are much less. We've not really looked at our regulatory regime. So the governor was very good to work with. We took 2 agencies, DPOR and Department of Criminal Justice Services. DPOR does all your licensing for professions and occupational licenses, et cetera, and said, let's examine their regulations with a goal to reduce them by 25% over 3 years. And I'm very happy about that. And hopefully we can get every agency to come up with a baseline of their regulations, and then let's see where we can prudently reduce. We've put just even continuing ed requirements, education requirements, I think have just gone beyond where people are going, I can hardly stay in the profession, or it just takes me too long to get in the profession. And millennials, I think, have a real entrepreneurial spirit, and sometimes you really discourage them if you've got to, I know in crisis counseling, which is a really huge issue, trying to help people with opioids, et cetera, trying to get licensed in that area, it takes twice as long in Virginia as almost any other state. And you go, well, that's rigor, but you can also go, who's going to go through that? We need those crisis counselors. Who's going to go through that regime anymore? So we got to be more efficient. So hopefully that's what will happen.
School discipline, especially K through like 3rd grade, has been a huge issue this session. As a former school teacher, I know you have a huge interest in that.
Tough one for me. Series of bills on school discipline, whether or not you can expel or not, how many days. Series of bills in that, basically would not allow you to expel at all, some for 45 days, et cetera. Jeff Bourne, I think, of Richmond had one that was in the 45 day range I voted for. I didn't vote for the ones that were more expansive. I'm torn. I certainly understand the argument. You want the kids in school. Obviously, at a younger age, you intuitively go, well, how bad could they have been? But also, having been a teacher and my brother being an administrator, and he really has never weighed in on this bill, but just thinking of administrators I know, I like to give them maximum flexibility if they have an extreme case that they can really deal with that. So I thought the Bourne bill was a nice step. So let's see how that does. I understand the argument to go further, but I just always like the flexibility on the local school side. So the school to prison pipeline is a concern, so please don't get me wrong, but good first step. I think the Bourne bill was the right way to go.
30 seconds. What's been your biggest surprise as Speaker?
Wow.
Having to stand up longer.
I did. On Monday, I stood up for like 12 hours, and I didn't trip or fall down or anything. So that was my biggest accomplishment. I also was told that on Crossover Day Tuesday that we got through sooner than ever. So I have a record that no one else will ever have.
Congrats.
So thank you.
Well, thank you for being here with us, Speaker. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Woody.
Kirk Cox, good to see you.
Always good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.